channel. Once again, thank you for showing up. And today we're done with the pre-text, the preamble stuff, and we're actually going to start talking about the writing process itself. So I hope you're excited, because I am, because now the time for excuses is over, and we're going to do this the way the Stoic philosophers did, by not focusing on situations beyond our control, but focusing on our reactions to them, because that gives us agency as authors. Again, the responsibility is on you and you alone. So, number one, stop blaming these outside factors beyond your control. It's easy to blame money. It's easy to blame our schedule. We're too busy. But that time is over. We have to stop playing the victim, and we want to allow ourselves the chance to be creative. That is the motivation part of this process. Or, motivated to create something, to world build. We've listened to these outside voices, we've silenced them, we've gotten over our initial fears and doubts about our own abilities, and that gives us not only confidence in our voice, but the freedom to act. So that's what we have to do. We just have to start writing. We have to keep doing things rather than thinking about doing them. This is how we exercise our willpower, and this is probably the most powerful tool you have as a person, a writer, an artist, a creator, is that notion that you can embrace ideas no matter what anyone else has to say about them, and you're free to create your world and invite the audience in to participate and share within it. That's what writing is. It's an invitation to allow people to take part in a discussion with you. It's the dialogue and the development and the evolution of it where we will find, critics, or we'll find support in what we're trying to accomplish with our narratives. These development tools are in place so you can find your voice and you can keep evolving as a writer. There's always editing to be done. There are always ideas that can challenge you, or ideas you can throw out there or bounce off of others. This process never ends when you're having a dialogue with your audience. I find that the best version of ourselves as writers or creators, whatever you want to call it, occurs when we're actively listening to our audience, and even those critics we don't necessarily agree with or believe in, right? We don't want to take their advice, because advice is selfish. It's about wanting somebody else to do something the way you think it should happen, right? That's why I like the term counsel, because counsel is offering guidance, and that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm not telling you how to think. I'm just offering you the steps that have worked for me in my own writer journey. And it's important to take breaks, to edit, to take more breaks, to sort of reevaluate the process, right? And that's how this dialogue takes place. This could be plot summary. It could be the continuity that we're focusing on. It could be character background. We're trying to get from plot point to plot point, and it doesn't really matter as long as you're listening to what you think an audience member would say about your work. In that same vein, you should take stock in the success that you've tried to accomplish. Do you realize, can you recognize that your influence through your artistic pursuits are already offering people things, right? They have writers and audience members have a stake in your success by reading what you've written, by analyzing images or whatever it is that you're trying to convey to them, and they've taken their time out of their schedule that belongs to them and invested it in you and your pursuits. And I think that that's important to recognize as a member of the audience in this process. We're just going to jump right into this next part. This is not an attempt for me to flaunt my ego, or it's not a self-aggrandizing moment. It is only a sort of first-hand recollection of my own experiences that you may be able to use and recognize in yourself throughout this journey and process. So yes, I will be talking about me as far as content goes, but what we're trying to achieve in this discussion that we're having, that I had previously mentioned, is really about you and your ability to recognize it within yourself. So I've got these listed out for convenience, and I'm not going to go over all these points, right? I'm not reading you a PowerPoint, right? You can pause the video on your own. I split these up chronologically because between each of these examples, there was sort of a paradigm shift in my life, whether it's going off to school, a certain moment of growing up, or whatnot, things of that nature that we're all experiencing. So the first thing I want to take note of is that all of my childhood creativity started off in the mind. I wasn't writing things down, but I reflected on things deeply. I've been accused of self-reflection a little bit too much, but I didn't realize that paper was an avenue. So all these things were sort of just churning in my mind all the time. And the strange thing about my narrative building is that whenever I start a story or commit things to notes, I already know how the story is going to end. But that doesn't mean I try to force it to meet that ending, right? In my experience, this has to happen organically. Rational events play out, they make sense, and all of a sudden, you've got a story. So as a youth, I hated reading. I loved films. I loved the non-linear storytelling of the directors I've listed there. And I was heavily influenced by the idea that you don't have to tell your story in a specific chronological order from one person's perspective. If you've seen Pulp Fiction or Snatch or Rashomon, you know what I'm talking about. And all these directors are influenced my sort of how I perceived narrative storytelling. So again, these notes that I was using just pretty much existed in my head until I committed them to a notebook. Now, in my sort of late teens and early 20s, let's say the ages of 17 to 22, when I was at the university, I started watching more films and getting ideas. And I was always obsessed with a character who was a representative of justice, whether that is a police officer or a detective, because that's what I was going to school for. And how a character would be dealing with injustice that they saw, or forced violence, or questionable motives, things like that. Recognizing the world as not being so clear-cut, black and white, good versus evil, or right or wrong. As I mentioned, I already knew where the story was going to go, and I knew how I wanted to begin the character. So throughout this process, and you'll see that on the left where there's the setting, right? That's where the process bit started forming. You know, I started typing on a typewriter. I love typing on a typewriter because it's old school. Nobody uses those anymore, except for me. I started turning these ideas into a play because I was focused on dialogue based on the Shakespeare I was reading. And I used outlines for continuity and plot points. And I came with this nightmarish dream board, which I'll show you. And these levels of narrative were sort of stacked on each other. And the funny thing about that is the only time somebody has seen this outside of my sort of friend circle was my best friend asked if I was doing okay because of what he'd seen. And I was embarrassed because I didn't know how I could explain this to him without him freaking out, and explain to him that this is how my mind worked. It works this sort of like spider web network connection of continuity points, you know, connecting A to B to C to all these things going around, because that's the only way I could flush these things out and make the plot make sense to other people. So beyond the superficial plot, then, I started outlining characters based on depth, right? There's always the argument of, is this a character-driven story or is it a plot-driven story? And I was reading a lot more, and I was taking in a lot more film. I was taking advanced classes in philosophy and whatnot at the university. And keeping this in mind, this continuity aspect, I wanted to make sure that all these characters made sense and that they were relevant to the story. So I just kept writing, editing, writing, editing. And there were a lot of times when I'd be out with friends and I'd grab a bar napkin and write something down, put it in my wallet, and leave. And they wouldn't know where I was going unless you were my friend. So some people, strangers, would ask, where did Josh go? And my friends would just simply reply, well, he didn't ghost on us, he just went home to write. So luckily my friends knew me well enough to explain to people who didn't know me that I wasn't being obnoxious, I wasn't being antisocial, I just had to get out of the situation I was currently in because I was in what I call the writer's mood. I had to go. So after the first novel was finished, I kind of sat on it for a while because I kept continuing the narrative with all these new ideas, these characters and stuff, and I wanted to include them in the story. So I ended up with a couple thousand pages. of things that roughly made sense, but I needed to be working on them and editing them and make them coherent and cohesive so that they made sense to an audience member. And this is where the discipline aspect of scheduling your writing and things like that comes into play, because I wrote every single day for a very long time. Sometimes it was a couple pages, sometimes it was 5, sometimes it was 20, right? I didn't just want to sit down and free write ideas all day long, right? Because then you're not focused. And that's another sort of piece of counsel I will offer you, is focus on the writing. Keep the ideas there, but you don't need to just be rambling all day on a piece of paper. And so after this process, I sort of wanted to see where this was all going. And so we're going to talk about the game of risk. So I had all these characters had their own little sort of player piece, their little card with ideas and stuff on them. And I had them listed out and separated. And I developed this sort of game board because I wanted to see, and it was a game of chance. It was just throwing dice. Like, it's kind of like war in cards, you know. If so-and-so is going against so-and-so throws higher dice, then, you know, they win, or whatever. And what's interesting is I actually was working on this while editing and writing one of the characters I was working on, and the character in the novel actually plays the game to figure out his next step. So he uses this meta game in order to sort of provide him some insight as a character, as a person, to figure out how he should respond to a situation he's found himself in. So I've got these characters, these novels always in the background. I've got the stupid board game I made up for no reason. I've got that nightmarish dream board going on. And I wanted to focus on visualization. So I started working on this graphic novel stuff. And this is all pre-digital art, right? This is all pre-Mid-Journey. And I had always wanted to hire somebody to be an artist for this story. But I also didn't want to have to sit there and explain to them the specific images in my head for someone else to commit them to a drawing. So I kept at this idea for years and years of wanting to do this graphic novel thing and editing my work and publishing these novels that no one reads, which is completely fine because I'm not trying to make money from it. And I also didn't want to have to listen to an editor say, well, I think you should work on chapter 3 of this novel because it doesn't seem like it fits with the rest, because I know it fits with the rest. So I was focusing on these other things too, these video game scene portrayals, paintings I was doing, song lyrics I was working on, short films with art grid, all the sort of stuff you can read here, because of I wanted to have access to all this technology so that I could be working on my director's eye, where I would be able to visualize something, write about it, and show it to the audience members very specifically. So again, currently, and you know, it's sort of already written, but it all goes back to the first novel where I wanted to sort of portray this on film so that people who don't like reading, like I didn't, how can I compress that into a movie, right? And again, the best example I can come up with of how tricky this can be is the novel Dune, right? Where if you try to compress everything into a 2.5-hour movie, you're going to miss some things. If you stretch it into a mini series, it might get a little drawn out. You know, David Lynch did a film. The Sci-Fi Channel did a mini series in the late 90s or early 2000s. And of course, you've got the most current Denis Villeneuve. I think that's how you pronounce his name, so I apologize, Denis, if I mispronounced your name. But much respect to you. There was some concern of, are we going to have to split this film into 2 films, or, you know, are we going to not get the financing? Is it just going to be a half-finished 2-part film, right? So, and I think they've gotten over that. I'm not quite sure because I'm not in their little directors group, but, and again, this all comes full circle with the Denis Villeneuve, because he directed the Blade Runner sequel. So I trust his vision, his direction. So if there were ever anybody I would want to have as my dream director, it would be him, because the story's written, he's done things I've seen, I've worked on, He's used authors that I've read before. And again, mad respect for that guy and his crew and the people that he works with. So now that I'm done being giddy talking about my pet project, which is never going to happen, I wanted to reiterate that this wasn't about my ego or wanting to listen to myself talk. I just wanted to offer you some insight into how somebody views the writing process itself and how world building can sort of, I don't want to say infect, but it can encompass a lot of things, right? So I wanted to keep this very short for you, so you're welcome. But in all seriousness, thank you for watching. If you have any comments or questions, drop them where you need to, and I will see you in the next video where we're going to be discussing the trope of the hero's journey and also finishing up the discussion of how this writing process actually happened for me.